welcome to the Great Big Book Club, and welcome to Jenny. How
Hello.
are you, Jenny?
I'm good, thanks. I'm in my garden shed.
So we have this book, your book, coming out today in America, and so we're going to talk about it. And you've got the paperback version that's out in the UK.
This is the paperback, which is out in the UK now. This one, the orange one.
So I love reading this. This is an amazing book, and you really have a gift with words. And there are so many glorious sentences I could pull out of this book. The story is Jackie's, and the setting is the Troubles in Northern Ireland. Can you tell us a bit about it?
Yeah, well, it's set in the mid-90s, so just after the paramilitary ceasefires. And Jackie is he's not in a great place. He's a bit dislocated. His father has recently died, who he adored and was very close to, and his mother died when he was very young. And he's living in a Protestant working class area of Belfast, and he's a little bit directionless. He has a very good friend called Titch, who's pretty vulnerable. Um, but who has a bit of a shoplifting habit, and it gets him into trouble with the local loyalist paramilitaries. And one thing follows another, and Jackie gets dragged into, tries to leave for London, but certain things keep drawing him back to Belfast. It's quite a compelling city in all kinds of ways.
So you put us there in the point of view of Jackie, and through him you guide us through life in Belfast in the 90s. You have a very quiet, you've very quietly, very deftly infused the story with history and opinion. Jackie has some strong opinions, and you of course have been a long-time comment writer for newspapers. But I felt I learned a lot while reading this about the intricacies of the conflict. What was that a driver for writing the book, the desire to help people understand?
I think it was. I think there are certain things that only fiction can do, and in that there are certain ways it can get to the truth about situations and explain things that perhaps the other fields I've been involved in, opinion or feature reporting, can do, but from the outside. So with fiction, you're sort of inviting somebody. It's a gentler kind of invitation to inhabit another world. Um, and so part of it was not just the story about the troubles in that time and the things that some people are going through that perhaps aren't so much discussed, but also just the sort of a love letter to Belfast in some ways. That I've lived in London for many years now, but Belfast still has quite a hold on my imagination. And I think I almost wanted to let readers inhale the atmosphere of that city with all its sort of sadnesses and complications, but its kind of wit and life and charisma. So the city is a big player in the book as well.
Um, so you obviously, as you say, grew up there in the 70s and 80s, and then you covered the story as a journalist on the Sunday Telegraph from 1995. So the violence, the paramilitary attacks, the notion that these are every day and can happen to anyone, was that the reality of life? And what did you personally see when you were growing up and covering the story?
Well, I think even within Northern Ireland, people had very different experiences. So there was a sort of generalized anxiety that came from the situation. So, from a young age, there were soldiers on the streets, there were bomb scares, they were checking your bag going into shops. I mean, that was just sort of general stuff. And then I think it could be increased according to, for example, where you lived. And in that particular aspect, we lived in a very nice place outside Belfast near the sea. So we didn't experience, or I didn't experience, the kind of levels of community tension that people might have had in more working class Catholic and Protestant areas of Belfast. But then there was also tension dependent on what job your parents did or your relatives did. Um, and so there were all kinds of ways in which the consciousness of violence encroached on the psyche, but slightly different for every person. But I would say that, you know, communally, maybe when you're older you reflect on it, but at that time it was our normality, and to be honest, within it, as you might see with something like Derry Girls, people had a laugh, you know. People had a laugh and a joke, and but when you're slightly distanced from it, you can see that our normality was quite abnormal also, and then comes in a certain analysis of it. So I mean, you know, we had friends who had lost relatives. The nightly news was full of the latest atrocity, so it was in the ether, but normal life continued alongside it.
Yeah. Why did you want to translate that into fiction? And was it hard to write the violence?
I think I've been interested in violence. I've always had quite a response to violence. You know, I was a film critic for many years, and I used to get quite angry when I saw intense violence on screen that was not taking you anywhere, that was sort of almost for the pornography of violence. It was almost for gratification or pure entertainment. And that used to provoke a surprisingly strong response in me, kind of anger. Because I do think that violence and the long legacy of it are very interesting and important. So you can depict violence or you can write about violence, but you've got to be revealing something more than just sort of allowing people some kind of vicarious pleasure in it. So part of what I was trying to do with the book was to give an idea of the legacies of violence. So a lot of characters, including some of the less likable characters, are dealing, for good or ill, with their own legacy of violence, and then sometimes creating more. So I wanted to give a kind of time span of how a violent act, almost like a stone thrown into a pond, can send out ripples for a really long time. So kind of the opposite of that thing of where violence is almost processed in the way that sex can be processed on screen as sort of a moment's exhilaration.
Yeah. And you write fear as well very well, and loneliness. There's a quote, "There's no emotion so reliable as loneliness. It turns up bang on time and promises never to let you go." But this is even described as a place of safety for your character. How did you find a way into these emotions that may not necessarily be feelings that you've experienced yourself, but were experienced for someone who's right on the front line, as it were?
Yeah, I think what you do is you kind of take something you might have experienced at a different context or at a more minor level, and then distill it or intensify it in fits that character. I mean, I've been very lucky. I've got a kind of large and supportive family, and I did come to London as Jackie did, but I never had that kind of loneliness because I had siblings here. So the part of that experience was similar, but the setting was completely different, the emotional setting. But I do remember I've always been interested with the idea of going to strange, to new places and making a different life from a blank slate. So when I was about 21, I was terrified by the idea of what I was going to do next. And I went to Prague on my own with a very large suitcase. And I, looking back at sort of, I didn't know anyone in the city. So for a week, I was in a bed and breakfast where the landlady spoke German, and the only thing she said in the morning was, you know, Frühstück, and I'd say, ja, bitte, and then I wouldn't speak to anybody else the entire day. And so I think that slowly, I got friends and things, but I think that there's a little feeling of what it is just to come to a city where literally nobody knows you. I mean, he does have the Whartons. He does have the Whartons, so he has a place to stay, has some human contact, but he's isolated, and he's also terrified of what might happen if he makes connections. That he might be disappointing, that he might kind of ruin things by making connections with people, making bargains he can't keep.
Yes, and there's a few instances of that. Uh, and that brings me on to something else I wanted to ask you, actually, about the ability of people in Belfast to bury information, or people who have perhaps come from places of conflict, to hold on to secrets for years. In this age of disclosure, this seems very alien. Can you describe how it was for you as a young person and for those around you, and why it was so important to keep secrets?
Well, I think the society itself was quite a secretive one for many reasons, because I think once you have a very electrically charged political situation in which people have strong identities and strong opinions, and that has actually then moved into violence, then speech itself becomes at times sort of dangerous. It's the handing over of information, it's the opening up of discussion. So on a very mild level, I mean, Seamus Heaney wrote about this when he said, whatever you say nothing, which was, I think, describing how people have conversations at that time about, in polite society, about anything but the troubles. That actually, because it was such heavily mined ground, that often people just wanted to steer away from sort of religion or politics at all. So I think there's a bit of that, but then also within paramilitaries and the sort of society around them, it was very important that secrecy was imposed, because that could open up, the word tout was very heavily charged. It meant somebody who talked to the police. And that was incredibly stigmatized and punished.
Like a cross.
So there was this desire to suppress. Information was kind of licensed. People could speak out only when it was safe to do so. And the violence in some ways controlled who could say things. And I think one of the interesting things about fiction is that in situations where people are understandably frightened of speaking, such as, paramilitary attacks upon young men, the fiction can illuminate something that is sometimes a reporter can find quite hard to get out, because when people are frightened, they don't want to speak. So fiction's been very useful in Northern Ireland to be able to go beneath the skin of things, especially where there is that silence.
Yeah. Should we move to love?
Yes, move from violence.
So Jackie, he's falling in love, and so you're writing about a man falling in love and his fear of female emotion, his fear of convention. He's worries about the flowers and the phone calls, his fear of commitment, and ending up with someone who he may come to find grating. And then when it happens, there's a whole new set of fears that he hadn't even imagined. What was it like to write about love from a male point of view, from Jackie's point of view?
Well, I think I've always been interested in the other, in kind of what you're not. And I think in a way a writer has to be. But growing up, I suppose like, many women my age, I read so many women's magazines, constantly. And it sort of struck me that they were very preoccupied with discussing men and what men were thinking and feeling. And there was a sort of whole cloud of speculation and discussion around this, and that, you know, men's magazines and things seem to be more interested in, you know, cars or running or, you know, whatever it was. And I started wondering, how must it be as a man to feel this sort of cloud of female expectation, but also disappointment around you, to sort of sense it. And Jackie's not very experienced with women. You know, he doesn't have a sister. His mother died when he was young. He grew up with his father, and there were two elderly aunts who were a bit sort of fussy.
Yeah.
So he doesn't really have a great template for navigating women, although he's, you know, quite attractive to women in the way that people who seem slightly reticent and unobtainable often are, because he keeps things to himself. So I think what he's doing is sort of fearing disappointing people. So when he has had connections with women in Belfast, he feels that he's been unsatisfactory, and he no doubt has. But he really falls for Eve in this way that he can't quite explain in London, possibly because she doesn't seem hugely interested in him at the beginning. And then once she reciprocates, he immediately becomes terrified that he's unworthy and he's going to disappoint her hugely. So also being in love is very scary, and I'm sure both women and men feel that it's terrifying to be in a relationship in the early days that actually matters so much. And it absolutely terrifies him because he's never had it before.
And that's an interesting counterpoint to the sort of terrifying life that he leads in.
Yeah, everything's terrifying, even the good stuff.
So he comes from Belfast so he has the fear of what might happen in Belfast, and then he comes in part 2 of the book to London and meets Eve, and you know, she's obviously has a few issues of her own, and who doesn't like a bit of dark, broken love. So they both have hesitation. You write, she was suspicious of love and therefore of me. She came towards me jumpily like an animal that was once pelted with grit and hasn't forgotten the sting. So you had to dream up a character who was a female suitable love interest for Jackie. That, you know, and I wondered how that was. Did you sort of make her around him, or was she a separate person? You brought them together.
I think she's a separate person, obviously, but part of the attraction is that she's been a little bit hurt, been a little bit damaged, and she's quite strong because she's had to get through that because she has a child. So Jackie represents quite a dangerous bargain for her as well. A bit like him, she's sort of learned to survive with a particular set of things that have brought her there, and she's got to look after the boy. So I think it represents a risk for her too, falling for him, and that's why he senses this sort of nervousness in her, but he understands that because he's the same. So it's going to make the relationship difficult for them both to trust at the beginning, but part of that is the feeling that there is something there, which is why it manages to endure a bit.
Can we talk about now the dogs in the book?
I was interested that you were interested in the dogs. Yeah,
I'm interested in the dogs because Major and Rollo, 2 dogs in separate. I think, is there another dog as well? Anyway, these are the 2 main ones.
The main dogs. Yeah,
they're both brilliant depictions of menace. And when I was reading them, I thought, were you bitten by a dog as a child? Did you have a bad experience with dogs growing up? Or did they represent something?
I think both. I think Northern Ireland is quite a dog-oriented society. Well, people like pets, but dogs in particular are quite a lot talked about. And in our house growing up, we had a cat and a dog. And I adored the cat. You know, the cat, I saw the cat as mine. And the dog was sort of, my father used to take the dog for walks and had sort of, the allegiance from the dog. So I suppose I maybe grew up seeing the cat as female and the dog as masculine. And in certain settings, well, McGee uses his dog as a symbol of masculinity, or of sort of
He is
potential threat.
paramilitary, yeah.
Yes, but then you actually see that the dog itself is trapped within this rather narrow yard, and it's trapped within the role for itself, which is, I suppose, a little bit like an echo of McGee also. And Rollo, he's slightly on his last legs, but he's mean. He's the dog in London. So I think he represents a small threat. And I think it's interesting that Jackie can't seem to sort of just entirely leave him alone. He baits him a little bit because he's a threat. And I think that's something about Jackie's personality, that he just can't walk past and ignore a threat. Something in him has to engage with it.
I wanted to ask you as well about the voice, because Jackie's voice is very strong. Like I could really hear him in my head. Was it how did it feel to go back and write in that very strong voice that you must have grown up with and slightly is lacking in London, perhaps?
It felt quite relaxing in a way for me to write in. I suppose it's a masculine voice, which isn't mine, though, I might kind of connect with that in some ways. But also just to write almost in a Belfast accent, because as you know, I was on the Sunday Telegraph for years writing sort of opinion and reviews, and in a way you do sort of, for that role, adopt the Queen's English. I mean, you can play around with dialect and stuff, but not too much, because you have to write for a very broad range of readers, and it's not fiction. So there's a newspaper voice that is, in a way, more proper and accessible. But this voice felt to me as though it could bring back all the kind of life of the city and the place where I grew up, and use words that I often don't use living in London, because people won't understand them, and why should they? But it allowed all that kind of language a place to sing. So I really enjoyed writing in that voice.
I know it's wonderful, and it really comes across. It's so clear. So that there's pathos, obviously. There's a lot of humour, but there's also this anger that simmers under the words in places, and anger with the number of homeless in London, with the sort of futility of the Northern Ireland conflict, and anger with one McGee, as we talked about, his father for his violent treatment of his mother. Is that your anger? Because as you just said, I've known you for a while. We used to sit next to each other at the Sunday Telegraph, and I don't recall ever seeing you angry.
I wouldn't say I'm habitually angry, but I do have a sort of a streak, a streak of temper. But I think that I think that some of this is a sort of urge to pull up the things that have, the wrong things that have become very normalized and very familiarized. And so sometimes you need to kind of look at them with fresh eyes. I mean, for example, the violence in Belfast or in Northern Ireland within communities, the paramilitary violence, has become just almost regarded as routine. Youths being shot in the legs, maybe 6 times, possibly disabled for life. A sort of another shooting, and it's now been going on so long, it's still going on, and it's not really awakening the attention of the world anymore, or even sometimes of communities. And so there's sort of sometimes needs, I suppose it's the urge to sort of give the reader a shake and say, look, this is still going on. Similarly with the levels of homelessness, something we've seen with coronavirus is that the streets, that early stage sort of melted away and became people went back into their homes and disappeared. And so then you really saw who was left on the streets before efforts were made to temporarily find them a place. But so I think maybe the writing's trying to do the same thing. It's just trying to say, well, look at this. And when you get a character coming to a strange city, they notice things that people who've been there for a long time have just stopped noticing. Of course, he's feeling on the margins of society. And so he notices other people who are marginal. And I think there are times when he thinks it wouldn't be too hard for me to get there.
Yeah.
You know, he starts to consider them in a way that people who are very settled are no longer really thinking about.
What similarities and what differences are there in Northern Ireland today compared to the ones you experienced when you were young?
It's on the outside, I mean, for the visitor, it's just a much more relaxed place to visit. I mean, sort of amazing restaurants and, well, before COVID struck and hopefully after, sort of amazing places to stay. It's much more relaxed, obviously. When I was growing up, it was quite, pubs were lively, but there weren't very many restaurants, for example. It was in some ways, you could see the trouble sitting on it like a kind of mantle, sort of grey mantle. People were sometimes afraid to open up, you know, shops that were in the rest of the UK because they didn't know sort of what kind of damage might be caused. It was a bit unpredictable. So that side of things is much, much better. But what's happened is, I think that some of the fear and violence has sort of continued to exist in pockets. So now you have something that was once widespread has become more concentrated into areas of the city where it continues but can sort of be ignored by the wider population. And I'm just sort of keen in a way that some of that dark side doesn't get ignored. I mean, particularly things like an epidemic of mental health problems. So there's a really serious suicide rate in Northern Ireland, much higher than in the rest of the UK. So obviously there are maybe issues that were legacies of the Troubles that just haven't been processed or dealt with. And, you know, we're trying to get those talked about.
Yeah. And I suppose seeing culture wars today and knowing what you know about how entrenched they can become, what concerns do you have when you see what's going on here now?
Yeah. Well, I think when you grow up in a where the entire country is sort of in an argument over identity and over competing identities and history and culture, one thing you do become very aware of is the danger of where that argument could go if it becomes too heated and if people stop attempting to understand one another's point of view. So, you know, I quite often am on Twitter and I'm surprised by the intensity with which, you know, many quite well-known people enter into arguments. And it's not that they're entering into the argument, it's the kind of language that they're using about people on the other side of it. And I just have a sort of intake of breath, I think, handle with care, because courtesy is kind of underrated as a social force, but actually it's tremendously important if you want to have a society where it's possible to understand other identities and for you to all to get along and function as a group. So the way that you talk, I think, is just hugely important. And I think I see, possibly because of social media and the speed with which people can respond, and the sort of instant emotion, that there's a real danger of that leading to some bad places for the rest of society.
So should we talk now about, finally, the final thing that I wanted to ask you about was about your writing process, which is always fascinating for people who want to write. They want to know how writers, what their process is. So yours was interesting because it was in two parts, one as a young woman, and then as the mother of young children. How did your experience of writing change in those two settings? And sort of how did you kind of conform to the two different situations?
Well, I think the first part of the book was written in a sort of the blur of my late 20s. And it started when I did go over reporting in Northern Ireland, and I saw some of these stories. And I almost don't remember the circumstances. I know I sat down at the computer sometimes and just wrote it, but then I stopped writing it when I got married and had children, because I was also writing for the newspaper and I just had a limited amount of time and energy. So it was quite a few years. I mean, it was 2014 I got it out again. So it was in a very old computer under a chest of drawers. And I was terrified in case it could only be extracted on floppy disk. And I was terrified in case it couldn't, be got back out of the computer. I'm not very technical. And then in the end, it was. So I was able to start again. So I was then in a completely different place in my own life. And to some degree, that's reflected in the last section of the book, where Jackie's quite a bit older. But the interesting thing then was that in terms of Northern Ireland, all sorts of stories had floated to the surface that we hadn't known then. And so in terms of sort of McGee and so on, there's some kind of resolution to the riddles of what made him as he was. And that was actually paralleled a lot in Northern Ireland, that there were answers to questions beginning to happen.
It's a brilliant, I mean, it is really a brilliant book.
Thank you.
I felt I learned a lot as well, which is always important when you're reading a book. And so really congratulations, and everybody.
Glad you enjoyed it.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Charlotte. Thanks for having me.